Thanks a lot. Okay, welcome back to Senate Education on Thursday, January 19th. Mr. Secretary, great to see you.
You too. Good afternoon, Dan French, Secretary of Education.
We had a good afternoon with the superintendents, your former colleagues and people you still continue to work with. We went over and heard a lot about.
In the morning.
Yeah, it was good. It was good. Gave us an opportunity in particular to hear a lot about school construction.
Oh,
And that's
sure.
really, without a doubt, top priority of theirs. And
Sure.
Next week, we have Treasury Secretary Pichek coming in to talk to us a little bit. We'll also have some of the federal delegation coming in to talk to us a little bit. Not their staff around. Is there anything on the federal side that can be helpful? And I understand Bernie Sanders did get appointed to education.
Yes.
So how can we partner with him?
Yeah. No, it is an important issue, and I'll touch on it no doubt briefly today. But I heard Treasurer Pichek was working on some things. We have the General Assembly asked us to do a study of financing school construction. So we're working on that. When I heard he was doing it too, I reached out to him. So we're meeting next week to sort of collaborate on that. But I think the House Ed Committee asked today. I think you've met Jill. Grace Campbell. Yeah. Jill and I are going into House Ed on a list of issues. One of them is an update on Act 72, which is the school facility. So we can do that for you as well.
Great. Great. So we have you in today talking about sort of equity, discrepancies in education, and this comes from partly some anecdotal information that we've all heard over the years.
Right.
We'd be happy to be proven false that. There are some schools that have some offerings, some schools that don't have other offerings. How also in the world, I think of you as somebody that's been in the forefront of education as it relates to technology in particular over the years. How can we use technology to possibly boost some of these schools up? Are the discrepancies that we're hearing about true? So it's a big equity conversation.
Yeah.
So with that, the floor is yours.
Yeah, and thank you. It's a good wide open question to kind of respond to, and I see you have, I brought a copy, several copies.
Yes, and we all have it printed out also.
If any of the audience wants some, I have, we also have Ray. So I think, when I think about the state's interest in education, sort of back up, I think the Brigham decision, when I started my career, 1997, Act 60, the Brigham decision really established this logic that the state's ultimately responsible for education. So we start thinking about how education is enacted around the state, all different patterns and structures. At the end of the day, the state's responsible. And I think about that in two words: quality and equity. Quality and equity. So our responsibility at the state level is to ensure that all students in the state have access to high quality education. Certainly, I think we knew patterns, I'll call it inequity, but patterns, differences, shall we say, in terms of how either quality is enacted or equity. Those patterns have been in the landscape for a long time. I think they were highlighted during Act 46. Part of the rationale behind Act 46 was to work a little more earnestly towards addressing some of those issues. I think it's fair to say the pandemic has exacerbated those issues. Similar to technology, I think events like the pandemic shine a light on things that were already there before. My experience with technology in schools, technology is neutral essentially in terms of what it does, but it does expose things, patterns that were already there, like we saw during the pandemic when people didn't have bandwidth and students driving up to parking lots of schools so they could get on the wireless, that kind of thing. So the technology's always been there. It can be an equalizer. I think recently, as we were working together with the General Assembly on the pandemic relief, we acknowledged that in some of our planning. So as much, and I mentioned this last night to those of you who were at we went and had a policy brief on education last night. The goals in our recovery are twofold. One is to address the impact of the pandemic on kids. So we definitely know learning loss and social emotional impact. But the other thing we wanted to do with the money, because it is one-time money, was to sort of invest strategically in things that would improve the quality of the education system. So when the money was gone, what would be left in the landscape would be an improved and stronger system. And as part of the work, really with pupil weights, if you're not familiar with that work, it's pretty complex, but I was asked early on in the deliberation, so if we give districts extra spending capacity, essentially in the form of additional pupil weights, what guarantee or assurance does the state have that districts will actually take that capacity and make improvements?
Great
Right?
question.
Yeah. And my response was, good question. We need to strengthen the regulatory framework. And I didn't come to that conclusion easy because I'm not necessarily a fan of more regulation, but one of the reasons, and I mentioned this the other day, one of the reasons we have patterns of difference or patterns of equity or inequity is the fact that we have a very loose and light regulatory framework in education. We allow those things to exist at the state level and largely in the name of local control. But we haven't been really interested as a state in really touching into that space. And one of the things when I mentioned that, the General Assembly challenged me to get more specific. What did I mean by that? And what came out of it is the work you have in front of you, which is the idea of what we call district quality standards, and also a new quality assurance process. So I thought I'd respond to your question on discrepancy by sharing this work with you. I think it is probably some of the more important outcome of the COVID pandemic and some of the more important outcome of the pupil weighting. Though I would say none of the issues of quality and equity can be addressed if the funding system isn't working properly. So that's like a necessary precondition to do anything. So kudos to us for taking that on. It's complex work. But now that we've essentially, I think, have an understanding that the funding system could work better and we've enacted that and that would be phased in, then we're left to examine, okay, so if we do have the money, what about it? Like what happens? And again, my diagnosis was looking at what other states do. We have a very light regulatory system in the state. So, and essentially to sum it up, when we came out of the No Child Left Behind Act, which was a very intrusive period of federal oversight of education, our reaction to that was to create a very light regulatory oversight system, which wasn't an unreasonable response in any means. I remember as being superintendent having to stand up and explain why all my schools were failing schools in 2014, in spite of them being some of the, I won't say the better schools in the state, but good schools. So we created a lighter scheme, and now we're, I think, starting to question whether that was a good idea. So this work we're doing, there's a couple things I'd highlight for you. One is we are involved in drafting this currently. Our goal, this is work we're required to do in law that you set forward for us. The timeline for this is that we're required to produce a draft set of rules by February, a couple weeks. We're on track to do that. So this is work that's on track. Part of what we're trying to do in the left-hand column of this table, I think we try to, this document I think is useful to a certain extent. It's more or less a one-pager that describes some complex issues. But the first thing was to list out all the key standards, just not all the standards, but the key standards that we think contribute to high-quality education. So if I go down that list, the ones on the first page are all brand new. These don't exist in regulation. This is part of the work we were required to do for the district quality standards. So we had no standards in business, budgeting, and accounting. Internal controls. When you see BUS, that's the bucket in the container domain that it belongs to. So we were charged for creating standards of business and operations. How districts manage their funds, which is a critical part of operations. So that was broken down. And I can talk more about the process working with stakeholders and so forth, but budgeting, accounting, internal controls, hiring and licensing, data management.
Sorry.
Yeah, sorry.
Can I just ask you a quick question?
Sure.
What do these two columns mean exactly? I mean,
Yeah.
I understand what, budgeting and accounting.
Yeah.
What's an annual?
I'll get there. In a
Oh,
second.
okay.
Just a second.
All right, great.
Yeah.
Thank you.
I'll try to, yeah. So first thing was to define what's in the left-hand column, like what are the standards? So just to point out, these were new ones, and we business ones we had to create essentially from scratch, working with business managers and so forth. Again, it's still in draft form, but we had new standards on facilities. So this, part of your question about school construction, part of the issue here is that we never had any regulations on school facilities. So, one of the reasons we have a lot of disrepair or unequal quality facilities, the state never really expressed any standards of quality. Other than when you came to do a construction project, and then we would say, here's the standards you need.
Right.
But other than that, we never said, that's not acceptable, or, so not an unimportant issue.
No.
Okay, so again, we're filling in some of the gaps and we think in our regulatory framework. So The idea of having standards on facilities is important. And also, this comes out of that law, Act 72, which we can provide you an update on, having an operations plan for your facilities, like how you clean, when do you clean your unit ventilators? How do you maintain things? That's an essential ingredient that was found in Act 72. Having a capital improvement plan, connected to your budget, like when are you going to make the investments, save up in reserve funds and so forth and so on. And then we did add the last point on the first page, emergency operations plan. We did add facility safety, and I mentioned school safety previously. So that was not required for us in the law. It kind of fit under the container facilities, but we broke out safety issues separately. So there are essential elements, as I mentioned in my earlier testimony, that we think should be highlighted. So we're anticipating doing it in regulation. Another new area are governance regulation. So we had no understanding of governance standards, school board governance standards. So we asked the School Boards Association to come up with them, and they did.
Yeah.
They went through an extensive process. Those are the three buckets: governance priorities, governance protocols, governance processes. That they came up with their membership. Really difficult work for them, but that was great. And then we include things from the education quality standards that are our current regulation. Like what are those essential inputs? So first thing was to define that left-hand column. I will say we had a meeting this afternoon. I know several of you were talking about teacher evaluation the other day. And teacher evaluation is likely to end up in the left-hand column. It's in our regulation currently. So we were discussing whether the state should have some assurance in that area. So that might be included. So then to your question, Senator, so now I'll move to sort of the construct of this table to the right. But the first thing was to define the standards. And then really the big three buckets in front of you in that first row, figuring out, there's basically three entities that control the quality of education. One are the local school districts. Second is the Agency of Education. And the third is the state board. So then figuring out, part of what we're trying to do here is get clarity over who does what. Like what is a local responsibility? What is a state responsibility? And then ultimately, what is the state board's responsibility? So like a lot of times when you're building these kinds of charts, we started on the far right-hand column first, because we know the state board's responsibility is already set up in law. So we filled that in. That's why the 16 VSA 165 is there. And that's pretty stern language. Basically what happens, and this language might be old, but basically the secretary makes a recommendation to the state board, one of 5 recommendations. One is that, this is when a school's been identified or a district's been identified as having issues. One is that we continue to provide technical support, like nothing else needs to happen. The next recommendation, this is all from 165, is that the state board adjust supervisory boundaries or responsibilities of the superintendency. So, this is pretty heavy-handed stuff. It's never been used, to my knowledge. Recommendation 3, that the secretary assume administrative control of an individual school or district or supervisory team, including budgetary control. And then 4, the state board close individual school or schools and require the district to pay tuition to send them out to either another public school or approved independent school. Or 5, the state board, we can require the school districts to consolidate their governance structure. So those are pretty significant consequences. So then the challenge for us was like, well, how do we, if we start on the left here with this idea of local responsibility, agency responsibility, and the state board, how do we pave a path from the left to the right? Like we just don't end up in the far right-hand column, like what goes on in the middle part, So we started with, okay, what are the local responsibilities? In the second row, this idea of annual assurance, we call these the mechanisms, how do we leverage local responsibility? Well, in the law, the state delegates responsibility to 3 entities: the electorate, school boards, and superintendents. We can't do much about the authority we delegate to the electorate because they vote on budgets and approve real estate transactions. That's pretty much it. But school boards and superintendents are delegated considerable authority in the law. School boards have broad powers. Superintendents are generically charged with the general administration of the school district, but they also have other specific duties and responsibilities. So the 2 mechanisms we came up with our annual assurance, like on an annual basis, the S means superintendent. We would ask the superintendent to sign on the dotted line and tell us they have certain things in place. Like, do you have a facilities? That's why the X is in the column. These are the things we'd like them to attest to on an annual basis. That would be our assurance. The school board would be doing a self-assessment. That self-assessment, we'd create a rubric with school boards and other stakeholders, like, well, on a scale of 1 to 4, where is your budgeting and accounting system? Like, what does that look like right now? And we would publish all this information on our website, so voters, taxpayers would see the stuff.
So S is school board, X
Yep.
is,
X just means do it.
Do it.
S was superintendent.
Under that self-assessment column, B or S, I'm sorry, you're right, B is board, S
Board.
is superintendent.
yeah, and X is
X just means we just have it covered.
AOE. AOE has it covered.
Well, in the case of the annual assurance column, superintendent's doing all those things.
Okay. Oh, I see what you mean. It's
Yeah.
already being taken care of.
Yeah.
Got it. Thank you.
In the annual self-assessment, we have a mix of boards doing some things and superintendents doing other things. So the idea of the local responsibility piece would largely be done through two mechanisms: annual assurance statements, that would give us authority over the license in the case of the superintendent. But we're trying to particularly entice boards into getting more involved in the quality of their operations. So we're asking boards to do a self-assessment on critical aspects. And again, we would publish those self-assessments. So then the question is, what does the agency do? And, again, we're heading towards these pretty extreme consequences in 165. So we thought the further you move right on this, we better have some sort of less subjective indicators, like things that we could really measure, and also things that really are tied to student outcomes. Like facilities, yeah, very important, but does it really impact student learning? Yeah, well, it can, but it's really hard to quantify that. We also have the issue of the federal government. The issues of accountability aren't going away anytime soon. So when it comes time to this identification, we're still going to have issues of proficiency measurements and all those kinds of things. So the agency, what we're thinking, has the first job of identifying schools and school districts that need more improvement, and that's a requirement of federal law. So what we would do is start with proficiency, because we're required to do that. So the first cut, if you will, would be for us, as we're required to do now, is to identify essentially the lowest group of school districts from a proficiency standpoint. And I'm using proficiency generally. It
Yeah.
includes proficiency and growth. It includes subgroup proficiency and so forth. It's more than complex than just proficiency. Once we identify that group of schools, they're not fully identified for these purposes. We'd say, okay, now we have a subgroup of schools. The next thing we would do is then analyze their core practices. If you go on the second page where those X's are, kind of coordination of curriculum, local assessment, you'll see those X's. The agency would assess the core practices or the core district processes that actually contribute to student outcomes. Those, they're called EQS. They're in the current education quality standards, and those X's that are on the second page, sort of in the middle, those are agency level responsibilities. So the 4 core processes that are in our regulation that we think directly to student outcomes are coordination of curriculum. You got to have a formal curriculum as a school district. You have to have a local assessment plan, so you have to be using data to analyze your results. You have to have a needs-based professional development system, and you have to have a tiered system of support. Those are been in the regulations for 20 years. We've seen them as essential processes. They were identified as essential to implement 173, the special ed reform. So this is where we think we can make a lot of progress. If we can really elevate these as important things for districts to get more formal on, I think we'll see an improvement of both the discrepancies, as you highlighted, and the quality issues. So the agency would say, okay, what are our lowest performing schools in terms of proficiency? And then we would analyze those districts relative to the quality of these 4 district processes. Okay, so you have low scores. Do you also have a low quality curriculum? Do you also have a low quality local assessment plan? And we would do some analysis there and say, you're a district that needs really focused support. So we would send you a formal letter in accordance with the law if you work on those things.
Yeah.
There might be districts that have, I suppose it's possible they would have high results in poor quality processes. They wouldn't make it through our filter because they didn't have low proficiency to begin with, but we'd still identify them for continuous improvement. Continuous improvement resources would be available to every school district in the state. Yeah.
I want us to take a breath.
Yeah.
Because that's a lot.
Yeah.
But also, just for our group, EQS exist.
That's correct.
Exist or exist?
Exists.
Standards exist. Standards, though, anyway, exist.
It's a group of standards, so yeah,
And then, but DQS do not.
brand new.
They're brand new. And so,
None of it's been implemented yet.
and does the DQS live on this chart somewhere? Okay,
They are the first group of standards that I was listing on the start of the first page, the far left-hand column. business, internal controls, hiring, licensing, data management. Basically, the first
Okay,
16 are
I just
all.
wanted to make sure that I,
Anything
so-
that doesn't have EQS next to it is new
So
DQS
they're-
standards.
they're not they're really administrative versus like instructional.
That's correct.
Got it.
That's when we started to contemplate putting a one pager like this together.
Mhm.
These are some of the decisions we've been testing with stakeholders. It's like, yeah, it's important, and we think we can leverage, particularly you'll see that a lot of those things fall in the local responsibility area. But if we highlight them, if we promote those data on our website, we think we'll get the cultivation of local responsibility that we need to help improve the systems.
Right,
But we don't feel as comfortable as we move farther right,
right.
leveraging, a self-assessment on internal controls as being efficient.
Right.
And the other thing I should say, by way of introduction, the top paragraph, there are other monitoring systems we have. So if you fail to use your federal funds correctly, we come in a different quality assurance process. So this thing doesn't represent the only quality assurance, like special ed has a whole elaborate quality assurance process. Anyway, the point I'd make, there's a lot here to Senator's point. Just want to let you know this work is in motion, right? So we're working on district quality standards, a new quality assurance process. This was the diagnosis and the cure, if you will, by the General Assembly to address the issue around the pupil weights. If we give you more capacity, what does that mean? And that gets to the heart of the issue of the equity and quality differences around the state, whether it be rural or urban. So the diagnosis was the state's been, I would say, deficient, but we could strengthen our regulatory framework to try to leverage our partnership in Vermont, which is a balance between local control and state responsibility, to try to get more out of the system, particularly out of those core processes, and try to get a little more formal on things like curriculum and so forth, where there's a lot of informality. In particular, I think, now looking on the post-pandemic context, I think this approach is going to be exceedingly useful because we're now seeing more turnover in staff, right? So I think Vermont's always been susceptible to informality because we have these large multi-district supervisory units, but now we see greater turnover in staff. So it's hard. I think I shared my story. I was superintendent, the senator knows, of a district that had 11 boards and 56 board members, right? So it took 9 years to get that organization to operate as a system. Hard work. It's possible, but it's hard. As soon as if you have turnover, like we're seeing in principals now, with 30% turnover, without state support to articulate a framework, those systems are not going to be able to make progress. And I have at least 2 SUs right now that have complete brand new central offices, right? So when we come in and talk about, this is like, oh my God, and then you throw down PCB testing or anything else, they're underwater from day one. Yeah. So the state, I think, by doing this will help the districts. I was talking with the superintendents like you today, and talking to my colleague from Champlain Valley School District. He's like, this will help us. We're a high-performing district. I'm familiar with they're a strong district, but this having this framework would help them as well. It helps you get focused, but certainly for the districts that don't know where to begin, it provides them a starting point. And you could imagine, like, if I hired you as a new superintendent, I'd say, here's how you did last year. Your superintendent rated you, or your boards rated you. They've identified some priorities. These are the core things you need to work on. Here's where you were before. Here are the strengths and weaknesses of your system. It allows you to hit the ground running as opposed to try to wait 3 years to figure out what the heck you're supposed to do. And so I think there's a lot of merit to this. So we'll be, we're still working through a lot of process and drafting. The next step is to turn this into actual language. So this is like a visual expression of a lot of complex topics as we're trying to make decisions about what should go and where. The next step is for actually us to draft this as rules. So when we do that, I'd be happy to share that with you and come back. We're scheduled to set that to ICAR, I think by February 7th. That's our deadline there. So that's getting close. And what we have to then anticipate doing are a couple other steps I put on your radar. One is we have to do an amendment to our ESSA state plan. That's our agreement with the federal government. So we have this idea of identification accountability. We have to have a plan for identifying schools and students. That's a requirement in order to accept federal dollars, and we can't operate the system without those federal dollars. So we are going to do an amendment to our state plan that allows us to operationalize this. This would replace what we currently do in terms of IFR process and our data snapshot. So we'd be redoing our data platform, making it far simpler than it is now. which will add capacity to the agency because we have a very, very complex, overly complex data platform. And the IFR process, the integrated field review process, is highly labor intensive. So we get additional capacity by getting to something tighter, more, I would say, appropriate for the scale of our state. So that we'd have to rewrite our state plan. That'll take most of the spring. We hope to really dig into that after the legislative session. And the last piece of it is to restructure the agency to supervise this. The agency always gets restructured based on the policies adopted by the state. So we would then have to revisit how we're deploying resources to provide technical support and oversight to operationalize this. But anyway, that's a diagnosis and a cure, if you will, on discrepancy.
So help us understand, the district quality standards will be decided in terms of academics. So is it each district individually will set their own standards?
No, the
okay.
construct in Vermont is that the State Board of Education adopts the standards,
Right,
and then districts adopt their curriculum.
right,
But this would say it kind of gets in that middle space.
okay,
And basically, we're saying we're not comfortable just saying standards and then you go ahead and do what you want.
good,
We're basically saying we want to know you have a formal plan to operationalize the standards. It's not sufficient for us to say we expect you to have curriculum. We want to know you have curriculum. And this is one of the hardest things, I think, in school districts, but it gets at the issue, particularly with poverty. Students in poverty are the ones that suffer the most when there's not a well-articulated curriculum. It's really hard also to structure, I would say, support services like special education, 504 EST, if you don't have an articulated curriculum. Because what happens, a lot of your staff have to run around and try to figure out what is the curriculum before you can remediate or provide support. So there's a lot of wasted energy in our system right now doing that, and also a lot of energy with teachers, individual teachers being their own curriculum developers. So, and I look, I've looked at other systems, and I've been to Finland and so forth, looking at high performing systems that have a high degree of teacher autonomy. None of those systems have a high degree of teacher autonomy and no formal curriculum. Like, teacher autonomy is necessary, but you have to have a framework for a curriculum. There's no successful education system in the world that has no curriculum and high degree of autonomy. So this kind of gets at the heart of an issue, and this won't solve that issue necessarily. It doesn't, gets closer to it, but I think, again, our diagnosis is we have a lot of really high quality schools in the state, relatively speaking. If we just raise the bar a bit on some of these processes, I think we're going to see a dramatic improvement, honestly, in terms of closing the equity gaps. We're also going to chip away at the sustainability issues and the turnover of staff. People aren't have to reinvent the wheel every time they move around. So I think this is a critical piece of work in a lot of ways.
Will it get to the issue that we've talked a little bit about, just to throw it out there, making certain that kids have a lot of opportunities around foreign languages, a lot of opportunities, because standards aren't requirements, requirements aren't standards. Standard could say, we want every student in Vermont to be exposed to a foreign language.
Right.
So that school could then say, okay, we're going to just do one language. It's going to be over here. But what gets us to where I think a lot of us would like.
This doesn't do that.
Right.
So that's where I think, when I was talking last night, and there were some questions about it, we have to make more progress on our virtual learning capacity.
Right.
We are behind as a state in that regard. There's always been an aspiration. I can remember when Howard Dean was governor and I was up in Canada, and he was like, I want every kid in the state to have access to every high school course. And
I like your imitation of Howard Dean.
Yeah, it was pretty good.
At first I thought he was sitting there, and then I remember his dance.
Everyone's been working on that goal for a long time. I think, unfortunately or fortunately, the pandemic dumped us right in the deep end of the pool, right? And I think the last time we had a real significant downturn in our economy, remember 2008, and we had a pretty significant investment of federal dollars into the system. What was called the American Reinvestment Recovery Act. Districts with capacity made hay with that. Like our district in Manchester, we had a lot of capacity and technology. We built a wide area network all the way up from Pollitt down to Sunwood, so we laid fiber.
Amazing.
And built the first wide area network among all those schools. Because we knew how to do that. But the poor districts didn't know, they don't know how to begin to do that stuff. So that just widened the gap. That kind of thing. We really have to be committed to, I think, laying down a really solid commitment to virtual learning. we've been making, those strategic investments with our recovery dollars. That's been a central strategy the General Assembly's acknowledged. We've been putting more and more money into the Vermont Virtual Learning Collaborative. More recently this year, we've been expanding the elementary virtual learning applications as a way to offer additional tutoring for kids. So I was trying to describe last night, we think of virtual learning at the high school level, it's generally organized around courses, but elementary kids don't learn by courses. They have classes and there's more ad hoc basis of learning. And there's a lot that can happen with that virtual learning as a resource. Like I used to be a geography teacher, so if I had Google Earth access behind me or using learning management system, it just allows us to extend the school day into the after school program to provide resources that were available today to the after school programs, summer programs. You really start to really offer a more robust curriculum in a rural state, which is really part of the challenge for rural states.
So even if you like these sessions on YouTube.
Right.
Afterwards.
Yeah.
If when I was a student, if I could have had that, I could have gone back when I was doing my homework and heard it again.
That's how Khan Academy got started. Guys like I'm gonna draw some tutorials for my nephews. Just took off. If you could go math in particular, you practice, right? If you could go watch stuff over and over again, you were sleeping in class, we'll go watch the YouTube.
Yeah.
Not to say I ever slept. Yeah, there's a lot of bad application of technology too. Again, I think technology is not good or bad. It could be just like any tool. It could be used inappropriately. But I think particularly for rural states, we really have to be aggressive in that regard. Our students, firstly, they don't know how to use the tools, so they have to get used to using the tools. Because when they go to college or whatever else they're going to do, even in our CT centers, if you look at the reading levels in auto mechanic today, they have to be able to use some pretty high-end technical materials. If they're not using the tools, that's a problem. But then secondly, if they're not getting exposed to content, that's a huge problem. So it'll be one of our policy priorities to talk about computer science, for example.
Right.
We think we can expand computer science through virtual learning. Computer science lends itself well to being taught online.
Okay. But the DQS, there's standards again, but not requirement. We're not going to see any change in terms of requirement. You could still have a school
in terms of curriculum.
You could still end up with a school that might stop after 3 years of math.
Yeah, well, that remains to be seen. I was talking about the left-hand column.
Yeah.
So the EQS, where a lot of that's included, we kind of didn't work on that. So the agency was charged with the DQS and the quality assurance. The state board is managing the EQS revisions.
We have Jennifer coming in.
Yeah, as a result of the Act 1.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
But there are things in there as we contemplate this comprehensive quality assurance model. We're trying to pull elements together. We had this conversation this afternoon around graduation requirements, teacher evaluation, like what are the things in EQS that really should be on here? So I think graduation requirements sort of survived our debate this afternoon as being one of those things that probably should be on the list. The Vermont, we have minimal graduation standards and we allow school boards to add on to that basically. But there's been some concern around special ed advocates in particular, like there's different standards for graduation. To what extent are schools enacting the state minimal standards for graduation? We don't, we sit there and wrestle with the ideas, what assurance does the state need? Is it fine to just say, okay, we expect you to do that, or do we need to raise the bar on that? And I think it did survive. So that would be something we add on the column here, is to really look at the graduation requirements. And in most states, that's very prescriptive because your diploma comes from the state.
Yeah. And we just had this conversation with Dr. Boucher and Dr. Gorham a little bit. Senator Glick raised the point. You look at Massachusetts, New Jersey, New York.
Right.
Generally, they look like they're doing better in terms of NEAP, thank you. Scores. Is it in part because of this, the educational governance that exists?
Yeah, it's so many different things.
Sure,
right?
of course.
Yeah, and Massachusetts has an approach. I don't think that would fly well here, but what we're trying to do is really leverage the Vermont context. And it's part of it's we're our own worst enemy. We're a pretty successful state, so we don't think we need to change. But then the idea of local control above all else, so. And actually it's that, I think I mentioned thematically in my first testimony with you, anytime we don't regulate something, there's a potential for inequity. Okay, so something to consider. I'm not saying we regulate everything, but we have to understand that there's a risk that we contribute to the patterns of inequity by not holding people accountable for sort of the same base standards. And that's kind of what we're wrestling here with this. So it'll be interesting to see how it comes along, but we'll have this written up like in a rule format here shortly. We're sending that out for written feedback from the different education associations. And right now we're on schedule to file for February 7th. So anytime in there, we could come back and show you more what this actually starts to look like as we pull it together. I think it would be useful for you to understand the overall regulatory framework, because it's a good orientation for new members.
Any final questions for Secretary French? It was very helpful.
Thank
you. Okay,
Thank you
yeah.
very much.
Thank you.
We'll continue the
Anytime.
conversation. We're about to hear from some teachers
Great.
to help us kind of understand a little bit about what they're seeing on the ground.
Yeah.
Thank you very
All right.
much.
Have a good
Appreciate it.
afternoon.
Thank you, Greg.
Yeah, let's go ahead and let them in.
I'm gonna drive home.
Hey.
Where's my car? Grab my girlfriend.
How far is your house?
About a mile away. Like in between. Where's your place?
Mine's just up on East State Street, behind the barber shop.
Oh, yeah, it's definitely walkable.
Yeah,
6 p.m.
okay,
6 yeah. How many?
The rest of the bathroom.
yeah,
4 to 5.
right, I need to.
We're just
Sitting
gonna,
is the new smoking.
do you mind if we just, yeah, we'll go off for,
Sitting
keep
is
our
the new
guests
smoking.